On spiritually applied tabletop role-playing games is Rory Philstrom. Rory Philstrom is the lead pastor at Christ the King Lutheran Church in Bloomington, Minnesota, and a student in the Doctor of Ministry in Spiritual Direction program. He is also the dungeon master pastor of a pioneering ministry called Roll for Joy, where he develops unique tabletop role-playing ministry experiences, including retreats, classes, and curation of online spaces. You can hear him talk more about all of this on the Roll for Joycast, a podcast that started as a result of the capstone project for Dr. Murad's class, Engaging in a Multi-Faith World. So please join me in welcoming Rory.
Thank you. Give me a minute to set myself up here. Share this. And there we go. And then do okay. So I'm going to be talking about play. And usually when I talk about this, I try and always include a portion of play in the talk. But I'm not going to do that today. That's going to be tomorrow. So if I get done with this and you're still like, I don't know what this means, come and play with us tomorrow. And that's how you really will get to understand what we're talking about. I'm talking about also a project that I did out of the Art of Discernment class in the Spiritual Direction program, which is a great class. And the project I did was really an experiment, and I'm going to be sharing some data from that experiment that I have. I think in an alternate universe, the other me was an astrophysicist. And so I love math and science. And so there's going to be some math as a part of this presentation, which is very different than the game experience of wandering around in the Feywild, which the game experience was, a land of fairy and fantasy and ridiculousness. But that's what we're going to talk about. So last fall, I developed a process that specifically uses the game of Dungeons and Dragons as a vehicle for sharing and processing discernment challenges in a group setting. So this was in a group setting versus Alex's, which was in a solo setting. So this is interesting that we've got kind of both ways of coming at discernment. I tested that novel discernment method with a group of 5 seminarians and religious professionals over the course of 6 weeks. And this is kind of about that experience. If you want to know a little bit about me, Dr. Sabia Tanis introduced me. I've been an ELCA pastor for 13 years and a dungeon master pastor for 9 years. And you can find out more about that side of me at rollforjoy.org. But to start, I wanted to have us just engage in a little ritual together. And this was a ritual that we used during our play sessions to open up, to move from that sort of gathering together as people to move into that space of imaginative play. And so this is adapted from a poem by Joy Ladine entitled Ready. And I was hoping that we could read this together. Will you read with me? Are you ready to be strong? Are you ready to follow God beyond the fear that warns you to hold your tongue when cruelty and hopelessness, degradation and evil stab you through the heart? Fear likes you this way, self-loathing, directionless and numb, believing that you're no one God would ever choose, no one God could ever love. Do not be afraid. God was here before fear, and God is there beyond it, calling you, every version of you, real and imagined, future and past, cypress and desert and solitary pine, calling you by paths you have not yet walked, by ways you have not yet imagined. You have nothing to fear and nothing to prove. Are you ready to be free, to be strong? The veil falls on our world and rises on another, ready to be remade. The premise of play is that we can use play as a spiritual practice to help get in touch with the most authentic version of ourselves, with the divine, and to learn how to live out of the freedom found in the place where those two meet. And I hold to this premise because play is basically this action of freedom. It's this liberating experience that frees us from the scripts that we normally live our lives by, and that we can live into a different version, a different identity, a different sort of experience in a different sort of world, and that we can learn then and use that as a spiritual practice when we pay attention to the space in between what we've imagined and then what we live in our day-to-day life. So that was the idea, was that play would be a helpful spiritual practice. The experiment of the thing was to create this spiritually applied tabletop role-playing game discernment group. And I'm thankful that Alex covered what a tabletop role-playing game is in their presentation. Now I don't have to. But so the premise of this, and just as basically for any gaming group, requires about 3 to 7 people. And for this particular group, I was looking for 3 to 7 people who sought to work through a particular discernment challenge that they were facing in their life. It also required a trained group facilitator. In this case of this experiment, that was me. 3 to 7 people forms this ideal party size for a tabletop role-playing game. It's also a really great size for group sharing and processing. The group gathered together. We'd meet for 2 hours a week for 6 weeks, and we'd use play as a vehicle for exploring the discernment challenges that each person was bringing to the table. So in the experiment, the test group had 5 participants. These are not their real names, but we had Harma, who was a 34-year-old male, who was Baptist, ordained parish minister. We had Shams, who was a 48-year-old male, an ordained military chaplain in the Church of the Nazarene. We had Rock, who was a 46-year-old male, a Christian UCC seminary student. We had Elias, who was a 43-year-old male, who was an ordained minister in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but was retired and on disability. And then we had Kit, who was a 58-year-old female in the ELCA, who was a lay academic and coach. So how we gathered together, our first meeting, we had a session 0, where in tabletop role-playing game terms, this is that first gathering where you're kind of coming to the common agreement about the game you're going to play. So during that time, we created characters together, established relationships, got to know each other a little bit, figured out how the characters would know each other. We reviewed safety tools that we were going to use during our play experience. We used a tool called Script Change that just has an ability. Anytime you play an imaginative role-playing game, there's a potential, especially with other people, that things come up because you can imagine anything. And the usefulness of play and that experience as a fun, playful experience can really get sidetracked or destroyed when non-safe things come up. So safety tools are really important part of this. And then we shared our real life discernment challenges with one another. Each person in the test group, they all had a specific challenge they were going through, a tough decision they were trying to make about their vocation. Just happened to be they're all vocational. After that first session, we had 5 other sessions, and those sessions ran loosely on this structure of 5 minutes for a check-in, 80 minutes for playing, 30 minutes as a processing at the end, and then 5 minutes for kind of a checkout. So each week then, I structured the processing part, or kind of the questions that we asked and processed through, were structured around the cycle, the social discernment cycle. So discernment is both, it's a process that you go through. It's also a formative act with traits to develop. And so I looked at both of those in this experiment. And so for the process to go through, I looked at this as kind of a process that we could walk through. So Elizabeth Liebert writes in her book, The Soul of Discernment, of Spiritual Practices for Communities and Institutions, about this social discernment cycle. And as Liebert describes them, the stages of discernment include throughout this kind of this primary state of spiritual freedom. And then from that, you choose the focus of the thing you're going to focus your discernment activity on. After that, you take some time and you notice and describe the situation. What are things? How are things now as they are? You perform some social analysis around that current situation. Then there's an introduction of theological reflection and prayer before coming to some sort of decision and seeking inner confirmation about that decision, and then reviewing that decision and seeking structural confirmation or outside confirmation. These stages aren't necessarily linear, but progress through the cycle is marked by experience of consolation and spiritual freedom, while an experience of desolation or feeling like you've hit a dead end, she would encourage you to go back to a previous spot in the cycle, reground yourself in spiritual freedom, and just retrace your steps and start over. And then there was a question of, okay, I'm going to do this weird thing, have a group of people play Dungeons and Dragons and call it discernment. How can I show Dr. Talvakia that this is actually effective, besides just having fun? I know we can have fun playing a game. Will it be spiritually effective as a discernment process? So again, I went back to this definition of discernment as both a process with the stages to move through and as a formative act with traits to develop. And so defining that formative trait then as this skill of discernment, I define it as an ability of an individual or community to apply wisdom to their internal and external understandings of their present situation and to make choices that are right, fair, and just. So I tried to find things that could measure this stuff. The decisional conflict scale was a tool that I found. It's a 16-item questionnaire that was developed by, we have it here. It was developed by the Patient AIDS Research Group at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. It was for use in measuring the state of decisional conflict in patients around important treatment choices that they were being faced with. And it was a way of sort of checking in with a patient if they're really on board with the big treatment decision that they just made. And I had a feeling, I had a hunch that maybe this tool, just modifying the wording ever so slightly to change it from just being like a medical treatment option to being just more broadly an option of a choice, that it might be useful as well in helping us measure whether people are further along the discernment path or not. And so this was that tool to kind of measure the state of discernment. For the traits of discernment, I found there's a discernment practices indicator scale, which is a 14-item scale that was developed for business use in evaluating leaders for the quality of discernment using 3 key factors: faith, intuition, and courage. It was developed by Hazel Troffer and others and published in the Leadership and Organization Development Journal. Because it was new scale and I wasn't quite sure about the ability of any scale to measure a spiritual reality, I added a few other measures just to get some additional information. And so other things that I had the players work through was a workplace social courage scale, a types of intuition scale, and an attitudes related to spirituality scale. And so the results. So after playing, I had people do these at the beginning session, and then I had them do them again at the end after that 6 weeks and just see what happens. And so It was actually pretty promising. And obviously I did this with 5 people once, so I would love to do some more of this. And as I develop my dissertation, I hope to be and go into practicum and spiritual direction, I hope to be able to do more of these sorts of groups. So not able to make any expansive claims, but it did show signs of being a moderately effective tool for increasing participants' capacities for discernment and being a significantly effective tool for improving participants' states of discernment. So in the numbers, what I mean by that is that that discernment practices indicator showed an average of a 10% increase in participants for the capacities for discernment in all 3 factors of courage, intuition, and faith. And that decisional conflict in the participants was reduced by an average of almost 50%. And so if you look at it, here's more numbers. Told you I was going to be a physicist. I like math. So the top one there, the decisional conflict scale, started out, the average decisional conflict within the group was at 48.75%. When we ended, it was at 24.69%. And the developers of that tool said, like, anything under 30% means there's not really a whole lot of conflict around that decision anymore. The discernment practices indicator had 3 different things that it measured: courage, intuition, and faith. I said average of 10% across the board. Courage was up 9.8%, intuition up 12.26%, and faith up about 11%. And then most of the other scales didn't actually show a whole lot of measurable change, but the effective intuition part of the types of intuition scale showed a jump of almost 18% in people's effective intuition, which I'll talk about in a second. So here's some more graphs of the individual participants and the average line. So this is the decisional conflict scale. You can see where people started and where they ended. So average about 48% down, with 2 out of the 5 participants going from kind of a moderate level of conflict around what are we going to do in this big decision in the upper 40 percentile, down to nearly 0%, underneath 10%. And so through this process, a couple of people were like, we kind of feel like we've been able to figure out what that question was that we were asking and working through in our lives. So that was really promising. This is the total of the discernment practices indicator. I've got those broken out. Here's the courage. So you can see levels of courage jumping up. Again, that was just under 10%. This trait, courage, saw the most consistent growth trends across all the participants. Intuition and faith saw more variable results, but everybody increased in courage, which matched one of my initial hypotheses that role-playing out situations that required their characters to practice courage would positively impact the courage of the players themselves. As you pretend to be courageous, you actually are becoming more courageous by exercising your courage muscle. That's why, we have games where we play at all sorts of things and that's how we learn some things. Here's the scale for faith, a couple significant jumps, and then some others, not a lot of change. That was kind of individualistic. And then let's see, there we go. Or no, that was intuition, and then faith similarly, not, sort of variable. But then this one was interesting. Effective intuition was up almost 18% on average. So effective intuition, the types of intuition scale broke out different kinds of intuition that it measured. And this effective intuition was the kind of intuition that relies on emotional input and associative processing. And this is the kind of intuition that plays a large role in religious self-reflection and creative thinking. So it makes sense to me for a discernment process that emphasizes watching for experience of consolation and encourages people to make metaphorical associations between creative play in an emotional fairy realm and their lived experience in the real world. It makes sense for that to strengthen participants' connection to their capacities for this kind of intuition. There was another kind of intuition, this holistic big picture intuition that I don't have the graph of, but it actually saw a decrease, which was interesting to me, just a slight like 6% decrease. But I thought, the nature of our adventure was also one that had a lot of unexpected twists and surprises that I felt might have made participants doubt their ability to fully grasp the big picture of what they were trying to accomplish, and how they could accomplish it. Instead, made them really focus on what are we doing right now. That it made them sort of doubt their ability to accurately see the big picture. And I wondered if that sort of paid off. But that's, it would require some more research to know how much the story of the gameplay affects the changes here versus how participants engage with the exercises of the cycle or just the nature of gameplay itself. Yeah, so my takeaway, obviously, I want to explore this further, especially with populations that aren't connected to traditional religious experiences. But my initial findings show a process that's fun, engaging, and demonstrably effective at improving both the state and the traits of discernment. And the participants echoed these findings in their final written feedback on the group experience. And they wrote the following. Sham said, "The play allowed me to explore the change behind my decision. The reason for the change was not one I expected." Kit said, "I felt like the gameplay took me away from people and patterns that expected me to respond in particular ways. This gave me a new place to explore possible changes more fully." Karma said, "Playing and thinking with a group of people I liked and trusted, having a low stakes environment in which to think about issues related to my discernment challenge, this really was a lot of fun and very helpful in working through this discernment challenge." Elias said, "The ability to talk through my difficulties regarding my decision as well as relating my indecisiveness to play was helpful." And Rock said, "I enjoyed connecting with the metaphors of being a shapeshifter, capable of changing to meet uncertain situations. And I appreciated the metaphor of going on a quest into uncertain territory, knowing that there's always another adventure ahead. I enjoyed reflecting on the ways that creative story making interacts with the work of discernment." As my presentation comes to a close and the veil falls on this world and the experiment of imagination and possibilities, I also want to end with the ritual that we would exit our time of play with, which was a ritual of prayer. And allow me to pray. Spirit of God, hover over us. Lift the veil on our minds. Awaken our senses to your world again. Awaken our love to your presence again. Awaken our desires to your desires again. Call and help us listen.
Great. Thank you so much, Rory. Are there questions?
Thank you for sharing. Again, I'm just like blown away by all the really cool and innovative ideas that have been coming out this week. I know that you only did this with like a few people one time, so you might not have the answer for this, but I was just curious if you think that the character that people picked for themselves played a role in their change, because I feel like if you pick a character that's very different from who you are, then it may open you up to being more flexible. So I wondered if you saw anything like that. And then a second question is, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Roll for Joy, because that really piqued my curiosity.
Sure. So yeah, I did this particular experiment once. I've done a lot of play in sort of an applied way, and had actually an entire retreat where we talked about self-reflection through the player character, and had people bring characters, one that was a lot like them one that they made that was not like them at all, and then just some other character that they made up freely. And anytime you create something, you always put a bit of yourself in it, even if you think you didn't. And that was one of the wonderful things for people to discover in that character that was not like them at all. They were like, oh, wait, no, this is like me. And maybe I like some of it, and maybe I don't. Maybe it's some challenging things. But yeah, it definitely definitely has an impact. And I like when I choose a game that I'm going to use for something like this, I like to have some freedom in that character creation moment, where people aren't picking a character to play, but they're creating the identity of that character as a part of the play. Because whatever they put out there is a part of themselves that they're putting out there to play with. And that so people do that in different ways. Like you said, there's people that just want to play like a version of themselves. That's maybe like, if it's in a fantasy game, maybe it's just like a little fantasized version of themselves. Some people pick like one particular trait of themselves that they really want to work on, and they try to pick a character that's all that. So I had a player who they really wanted to get more in touch with their, not in this group, but in another occasion, where they really wanted to get in touch with their like sexuality and their ability to play like a sexual person, and feel like they're a little bit freer with their body. And so they picked a character who was like super lusty, bard, always wanted to like seduce everybody, and was just like very comfortable in their sexuality. And they were very uncomfortable playing that character. But they kind of played it as this like experiment. Can I learn to be a little bit more like this? And then there's sometimes people play as their shadow selves, or like that character, that part of themselves that they hide, or they think that isn't okay to be. But in a game of imagination, you can bring it out and you play with it, and maybe it's some self-destructive tendencies that they don't want to play out in their own lives, but they can feel stronger about playing out in a game. I run these games with my youth group at the church I'm in, and we had a game. One of the kids had some self-destructive tendencies in the past, and played a really self-destructive character, but in a big way in the game. And that was just kind of their way of saying, hey, there's this really dark side of me here. So yeah, lots of different things. And then you asked about Roll for Joy. Yeah, so we have a Discord channel, where we have ongoing conversation, and there's ongoing games. I've been running games with ministry leaders. Mostly it was the initial group of people for almost 10 years. It was a way of creating peer relationships in Western North Dakota when we were all very, very far away from each other. And then I run an annual retreat. I'm in a period of vocational transition right now, so I don't have the details on that retreat at the moment for this year, but it will probably be in either August or October this year. And we like to go to the ARC Retreat Center up in Stanchfield. Has been the home of that. And so there's blog on there. We have a podcast that I said. I think we just recorded our 3rd episode, and we're going to be recording episodes monthly. So things like that.
Thank you, Rory. Love it. As you know, this is maybe a question for both you and Alex. How has role-playing games helped you in your discernment to be spiritual leaders? Like, draw it back on you, your character development, your rolling the dice, journaling, whatever it is. How has that been for you?
Yeah. So for me, it wasn't part. I mean, I played role-playing games as a kid, but really picked up the hobby after I was already a pastor. And for me, the game space has been a way to stay connected to my humanity in a role in a profession that often wants to like only see you in certain parts of you, and that other parts are like not allowed. So it's been something that's been really important for me to stay connected to my humanity as well as in the spiritual work. And it's been something, so my son was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy shortly after his birth, had to receive some pretty intense treatments. My wife suffered from some postpartum mental health things after both of our children were born. That was very difficult for a long period of time. And play was something I held on to through those really personal challenges as well, to remind myself that I'm more than just the circumstances of my day, and that my humanity is much bigger than just what's happened to me. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say I'm in a similar boat with that. I think for me, the orienting my life toward play and like remembering that I don't need to take myself so seriously has been a big part of it. And also, there's a lot of, in a really good gaming group, you hold space for each other and like leave openings for each other to do cool things. And like that space holding has been something that I have always done in my life. But like that, I think playing with it has developed that skill significantly.
Yeah, I am curious about my understanding about the gaming world is that it's predominantly men who play. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on questions around safety and accessibility for non-men to get into gaming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is. I would say it's changing. I think the world of games, just as a sort of socially acceptable hobby, has really like exploded in the last 10 years. And there's been a trajectory of growth. And I think there are more and more spaces that are just like women friendly, queer friendly spaces in the tabletop role-playing game space and in other gaming spaces. I think that's really a value and a priority for a lot of the gaming community, and something that it gets really centered in the gaming community. And yeah, I think somebody, I think like the cishet male game players gravitate towards certain spaces, and then queer or women players find safety in other spaces. And maybe Alex, you can talk to that too. But I do think that there's a potential in this work, not just for reaching people that are not traditionally, the like queer people and minorities and people that aren't necessarily attracted to a church or spiritual religious experience, that might come and be a part of something weird like a role-playing game spiritual experience. But I think it's also an opportunity to reach cishet men in a way that, I mean, there's a problem with masculinity in our country. And I think there need to be spaces for men to come and heal and find out better versions of themselves. And so I think there's also space for this kind of a hobby and this kind of work to provide a space for that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Role-playing games are really having a moment right now, it feels like. Like there's really been an explosion of the popularity of them, and so many of the more independent games that are coming up are by queer creators and women and trans creators, and like it's very cool to watch. But I think Rory's right, is that the groups tend to self-select based on identity a lot of the time. And so while it can often still feel like a very male and white male dominated space, there are increasingly more and more spaces for other people to come in and that are catering specifically to other groups of people, which is great to watch.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you for sharing your astrophysicist self with us. I really appreciated that. I appreciate you gave us that context too. I'm curious, because you work in a pastoral setting, if you've used role-playing games to work through group conflict or congregational conflict, or if conflict comes up. And I think I'm thinking of Erica's presentation earlier talking about conflict avoidance in congregations, and if there's a way that you found that using play can help congregations kind of surface discord and engage with it.
Yeah. I've used play in my congregation in lots of ways. I've used role-playing game play mostly with my work with the youth, and used it in for a variety of different purposes. Not, I mean, there is a way of saying like, okay, here's a small group of people. There's some conflict among these people, and as you know, my role as the game master is not necessarily to like lay it down and say you know this is the way we're going to resolve this, but provide prompts and situations and encouragement to the players then to like have conversations among themselves and try and resolve like how do we deal with this problematic player and this problematic presence in our group. So in like a very micro scale, just within like very interpersonal dynamics, I've used it. What your question made me think of is actually what we just did at our congregational annual meeting in January, where our congregation, you know, we're facing a budget shortfall, we're declining attendance, the pandemic was hard on us, and we're passing a budget this year that's moving us from 2 pastors down to 1 pastor by the end of the year. Very difficult conversation to have, and very heavy, and like you feel like you're losing everything. But there's also like a lot of life still in the congregation and a lot of really good things happening as well. And so as a way to lift that up, I developed a game. We played CTK Land. It was just kind of a way of, we played Candyland and answered trivia questions and just kind of remembered, yeah, I divided people up into like, you're the marshmallow team and you're the gingerbread team. And we played Candyland and answered trivia questions about some of the great things that had happened in the previous year. And we spent like half an hour of our annual meeting playing Candyland as a group, and just spending that time in play and allowing people to like laugh together and remember fun things together. And, you know, there's a little friendly competition and just like changed the whole mood of that meeting. And then when we got to the hard stuff, it was like, yeah, we all know we have to do this, fine. But it didn't dominate. And I think remembering to always find the fun in whatever the thing is that you're doing can bring a lot of life to the way your congregation goes.
Any other questions?
I don't know if anybody already asked this, but do you ever use this for discernment in your congregation? Or do you have any ideas about how you could?
Use it for discernment?
Yeah, like as how the congregation is going to move forward in a certain area or make a decision.
Yeah. So I think this experiment that I did was really, it was a group process, but we weren't a group discerning a group challenge. It was individual challenges being discerned in the group. And it was helpful for that. It gave each person like an opportunity to think through as they played their character in different ways. And then we asked questions about like, how did this relate to your challenge that you're facing? You know, the way that you showed up as your character today, what does that have to do with this part of your challenge? That was really fruitful. I mean, I think there's potential, like the social discernment cycle and that process that Elizabeth Liebert lays out is meant for a group to work through together as a group discernment process. And so I think there are ways that would do that. Playing a role-playing game often becomes like, how am I showing up as me, as my person, and how am I working together with the other people? And so it could be something that I could see being really useful for like a team that's figuring out like a new team or a team that's trying to deepen their relationships with one another to figure out, okay, well, how do we work together and who are the people that have certain skills that they bring to the table? Who do we call on in this sort of circumstance and that sort of circumstance? So I think it could be helpful in like identifying those traits, but it's really good at personal discovery. A little bit harder to work as a whole congregation, but there are, I guess I have done this with a pastors conference down in Rochester. I had them pretend their churches were a character, and they had to like give their churches the ability scores: constitution, strength, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, charisma. And it was like, all right, you have these 6 scores, you have to rank them for your church. Where are you strongest? Where are you the less strong? What are the special powers that your congregation has that aren't unique? And that was helpful, just kind of like in what's the identity of our place.
Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Rory. What I didn't articulate very well with Alex, but what is really exciting for me to see is this as a tool for teaching people how to take risk. And I just want to name, it sounds like the skillful ways you guys set up that safety so that people can take that risk. It's very exciting to me. Because I do go to an ALCA church, discernment's like a very, to me, churchy word. And I'm curious if you use a different word when you're talking about this process to people who might come from a more secular background. And I know too, discernment is not just a religious word, but if people don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to just use it and say, and then like define it if I have to. But I get like this experiment was with very churchy people, and so it would be like there would be an open space of learning as we do it in other spaces. I don't know. What you work with a less churchy crowd?
Rory, can you talk a little bit more about how you structured the campaign that you use? I'm wondering if you use their kind of discernment goals as like part of your developing the campaign, or was it more incidental? Like, how did that work?
Yeah. So I put a lot, like it was challenging because I wasn't sure how to do it. And they all had their different challenges. It all ended up being vocational. And so what I did to start the session was I said, okay, the very first session, I'm going to make them make a vocational decision by the end of it, or that was kind of one of the conflicts. And so there was a dungeon that they all had some job in doing, and that they were presented with choices, and there were a few different options, very different options about where the adventure might go after that. And then as a group, they had to decide what was going to be their job, what was going to be their adventure that they followed. And then I just tried to stay one step ahead of them as we played. So they ended up picking the option that I did not think they were going to pick, which involved helping a fairy go into the Feywild to go talk to the Fey Queen about some big problem that was going on. And so I had to kind of create that. But that's the fun for me of being the game master too, is I get surprised. I don't know what's going to happen, and then I try to, lay down enough tracks in front of a group so that I know. And it was short session, so it wasn't too bad. But yeah, the story, I don't know how much it mattered, honestly. Like we had different things, and I made them like explore different parts of themselves. And there was some of that was intentional, but then a lot of it was just kind of like stuff that would have happened in any gaming session that they then like read back into their own ways that they showed up as their characters. Oh, this is what I'm working out. This is what I'm, playing off of. And that might have happened in any game circumstance. I don't know. So. Great questions.
Any others?